SWA Secretariat. Just testing the sound for the moment. So thankful for those that are putting their names in the chat. Please do not forget, if you're joining this webinar with other colleagues with you, please do tell us who else you're joining with and the organizations that they're representing. Please let me know just by typing in the chat if you're able to hear me loud and clear, and we should be able to start on the hour. For now, I just wanted to make sure the sound is working well. Thank you and welcome. Hello, good morning again, and thank you so much for joining us at this time. We're so grateful to those of you that are already confirming in the chat where you're joining us from and who else you're with on the call. And this is a repeat webinar for the preparatory process for the high-level meetings, which will be taking place in April. Today, we're focusing more on financing, particularly on how to utilize existing resources better and also on how to attract additional financing. So that would be the core of the presentation today. However, before we get to that point, we will preface the discussion by an update on the sector ministers meeting as well as the finance ministers meeting. And we will also have just a very quick question and answer session on the guidance note that were sent in case there are any clarifications that are required, and basically on any suggestions around the preparatory process. Looking at time, what we have intended is to cover the substantive components of the webinar, hopefully within the hour, but we will leave an additional 30 minutes just for anybody who would like to remain and have further discussions. So we will not close the webinar until about 10:30 New York time, which is an hour 30 minutes from now. But we hope to be able to cover the substantive presentations within the next hour. So to get started, we'll just give a very quick update on the sector ministers meeting in terms of the planning so far for that meeting, and then I'll ask Dominic from the World Bank to do the same for the finance ministers meeting. And then after that, I will we'll have a very brief question and answer session on both the finance and sector ministers meeting, but also on the more generally on the preparatory process. We will then get onto a short presentation on the collaborative behaviors country profiles, which, if you recall, those of you who've joined previous webinars, we've covered the collaborative behaviors in terms of what they are. And then we talked also when the indicators were agreed. So today we'll just hear a bit more about the country profiles from our colleague Betsy. And then after that we'll get to the substantive discussion on on financing. So in terms of a quick update on the sector ministers meeting, we did provide an update last time that mainly the focus of this meeting will be to raise awareness among ministers of the challenges of the WASH targets of the SDGs and the changes required to meet them. So this will look a bit more on the implications of the Sustainable Development Goals and what they mean for the sector for various countries. That then there will also be a follow-up on and exchange learning on the building blocks of a strong sector. These were building blocks which were discussed in Addis Ababa. So the sector ministers meeting will make some follow-ups on that, basically by looking at the policies and plans that are required to be able to respond to the needs for the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the institutions, the financing, as well as the capacity that is required to catalyze action towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The other objective for the sector ministers meeting will be to enable ministers and senior representatives of development partners to discuss the essential collaborative behaviors. These are more or less the ways of working around development effectiveness, and particularly they include aspects such as enhancing government leadership and using and developing and using country systems, developing them where they do not exist, or strengthening them where they are weak. As well as using one platform for mutual accountability and making sure that evidence plays a critical role in decision making. And the last collaborative behavior is also on building sustainable financing strategies that incorporate the 3 T's, that's tariffs, transfers, and taxes, and we'll see a bit more of that in the discussion later on. The sector ministers meeting will also discuss on attracting and utilizing adequate financing in advance of the finance ministers meeting. So this will create a line of sight with the finance ministers meeting, and the plan is that there would be a presentation, or rather a discussion close to the end of the sector ministers meeting that links the 2 meetings on financing. The anticipated outcomes are twofold, one being an agreement on the follow-up action by SWA partners at country level to reflect these fundamental elements and behaviors that would have been discussed in the meeting, and also just to create a shared understanding and agreement on a framework for action for the sector that includes an articulation of both what building blocks need to be put in place as well as how stakeholders work together. So these are the anticipated outcomes. In terms of the other parts of information that would be critical at this stage, that the meeting is planned to be a day and a half, and the dates have now been agreed to be April 19th and 20th, which will be Wednesday and Thursday, and that the agenda will look at the building blocks and behaviors as discussed, have some ministerial dialogues on three ministerial dialogues, and we learned in Addis Ababa that ministers like these moments when they can discuss with each other on critical things for the sector. So the idea of these meetings is to preserve space as well for those ministerial dialogues, and then also having a link, a line of sight with the finance ministers meeting. So this is briefly in terms of an update for the sector ministers meeting, and that colleagues can anticipate invitations to start coming in the next few weeks, now given that the date has now been agreed to be the 19th and 20th. At this point, I would like to hand over to Dominic to do just a quick wrap-up or update on the finance ministers meeting. Dominic.
Thank you very much, Sitali, and it's great to see lots of people I haven't met for a while, and to meet virtually many other people. I'll keep this update very brief because the end presentation on financing is really the detail. I think the key things here are that the finance ministers meeting, the theme around it is going to be very pointed this time round. And it's around these three blocks that we have on slide 7. The first one is helping finance ministers understand the magnitude of the challenge. When we shift from MDG to SDG, just how much more funding does that require, but also how much more benefit can be accrued by investing in the SDGs versus the MDGs. The second block, the green block, is about using existing financing more effectively. So we all know there's a lot of inefficiency in the sector, and we want to bring lots of examples of how the water and sanitation subsectors separately can double down and squeeze a lot more efficiency out of the existing funding. And then thirdly, we want to link those efficiencies to the sector's ability to access new resources, and particularly domestic private finance. Back to you, Sitali.
Thank you so much, Dominic. So that was a quick update on the sector ministers meeting and the finance ministers meeting. I would like to mention also that in case you have a question, please type it in the chat, and when we get to the question and answer session, those of you that have got audio enabled gadgets, we should be able to hear you, but I think it would be more efficient if you type in the chat. Just a very quick recap of the suggestion around the preparatory process. We did send around the guidance note for the preparatory process a few weeks ago, with the suggestions that countries and colleagues could utilize the ongoing processes at country level to have analysis on the SDGs, particularly focusing on the baseline and the vision, and using that to also have discussions on the financing that is required to achieve the SDGs, and also to discuss how prepared the sector is to catalyze progress. So part of what was also suggested was that countries could develop a country overview, really short, just 4 pages, that would bring all this information together in terms of the SDG vision and baseline, in terms of the sector readiness by looking at the building blocks and collaborative behaviors, and then and also looking at the financial information in terms of the investments that are needed, the financing gap, and utilizing existing resources better, as well as additional financing. So you will see that the conversation today will focus a bit more on this financing element, and the presentation to be given shortly by Betsy will help on the sector readiness in terms of the collaborative behaviors. At the global level, we have done 3 webinars, the one that we're having now being the 3rd, but in case our colleagues in various countries have not been able to join the previous webinars or to see the ones that were recorded, please do not hesitate to request for a bilateral conversation. We are very happy to do that. There is also on SDG financing, there's a costing tool that was shared to help calculate the investment needs. There is a help desk for that. In case you need any support, please do not hesitate to get back in touch with us. In the coming weeks, our colleagues at JMP will also be circulating preliminary estimates, baseline estimates, and we think that those would be useful in the country overview in terms of putting information on the SDG synthesis. And then the last maybe before that, there's also an input paper which will just put across most of the concepts on financing that we'll be sharing in this week. So you could be on the lookout for that. Our colleagues at the UN Water Glass team have generously helped to generously putting together the SWA Collaborative Behaviors Country Profiles. These are country profiles that would be very helpful in discussing the sector readiness alongside the conversations on the building blocks. And I would like at this point to pass on the mic to my colleague Betsy to cover part of that on the collaborative behaviors, and then we'll get to the questions. Thank you. Betsy?
Yep, thanks, Satali, and welcome everyone. It's great to see such a large group of people getting ready for the HLMs, and so I'm going to briefly discuss the collaborative behavior country profiles. Next slide, please, Satali. Okay, and so if you've been to any of these presentations before, you have probably seen what is now, I would say, a famous slide that outlines the 4 collaborative behaviors. The first one is enhance government leadership of sector planning processes. The second is strengthen and use country systems. The third, use one information and mutual accountability platform. And the fourth is build sustainable water and sanitation sector financing strategies. And these behaviors have been agreed upon and endorsed by SWA. I think the process started over 2 years ago. Next slide, please, Satali. Oh, and then so with this, as I mentioned, the discussions initiated with the country process is what was then a task team in December 2014, and then through all of the Global Monitoring Harmonization Working Group and Country Processes Task Team / now Working Group meetings, the indicators had been finalized and had been tweaked and had lots of discussion about them. And so WHO through GLASS is leading the monitoring strategy in close collaboration with WaterAid and input from key experts. Throughout this whole process, it has been very open and consultative. We've had feedback from governments, from CSOs, from other donors. So it's really been trying to get as much feedback as possible for everyone so that these indicators are as useful as possible. Around this time last year, the GLASS team prepared the first 5 country profiles as a proof of concept that were presented at the ministerial meeting in March 2016. From that, we received lots of positive feedback, and we continued to tweak the profiles to make sure, again, that they would be most useful for help for government and development partners. And then the need and importance of this work was recognized by the SWA high-level working group, and they requested a scale-up and to produce country profiles for all of the countries. And so that is currently what the GLASS team is working on, and they'll be ready in batches starting, I think, in the next week or so, and then SWA will distribute them to countries as they are ready. Next slide, please. All right, and so the profiles for this round, they're going to be 6 pages, and they really show indicators for both the government and development partners. And the people putting this together thought that was key because for the sector to be strengthened and for these behaviors to really have an effect, they need to be practiced by both the government and development partners. And so the profiles will highlight how the governments and development partners are doing on the indicators side by side. We have tried to use publicly available data. So data is coming from GLASS, OECD, CPIA, and PEFA. And so it's all publicly available data. And that idea was to not put an additional burden on countries to collect more data. And that being said, while there is data for many of the indicators, there is not information available for all countries or all development partners, but we still wanted to focus on what we should be measuring. And so data gaps also provide a starting point for discussions. And the point of the profiles is really just to encourage deeper discussions on more effective collaboration and strengthening of the national watch sector. So the profiles will be quick and easy to use in a concise way of laying out a lot of information that can spark much more in-depth conversations. Next slide, please. And so this is what the profile looked like at the last from March of 2016. And so as I mentioned, they're going to change slightly, but they will still have that same format. They'll just be the indicators have expanded, and so we have more pages, and so it'll be 6 pages instead of 4, but the same basic structure of having the indicators in the line with the government and development partners next to each other will stay the same. And then next slide, please. And so then here, how can government, so when you'll receive this in your email inbox, how can development partners and country governments use the country profiles? And as I mentioned before, it is really to spark discussion. We're putting out a lot of information in a simple way with stars and with check marks and X's, so just really giving a brief overview of what countries and governments can do, and it's a way to ensure mutual accountability. So some examples could be the government will make procurement procedures more transparent, and development partners will progressively increase the use of these systems, and that would be relating to behavior 2. And then, or another example would be the government will develop a financing strategy which takes into consideration the 3 T's. And really, the sky's the limit with what government and development partners want to focus on with these behaviors and how example actions they want to take, but the profiles are a starting point for further discussion. And that's all I have, Satali. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. So thank you very much. That helps it also with sort of some ideas of what discussions colleagues can have once the profiles are received. And like indicated before, this would really be useful for that part on the sector review. So we do have some questions in the chat. I think we have one that I see from Leslie about what the CPIA is. Betsy and Dominic, I'm sure you can be gearing up to respond to that. We will also just check at this time to see if there are any questions on the 3 parts that have been presented so far. So if there is any question, please do type it in the chat or feel free to take over the mic. Betsy, would you like to respond to the question about the CPIA?
Yes, the CPIA is the Country Policy and Institutional Assessment from the World Bank, and we have used that to look at behavior 2, which is strengthening and using country systems. And then while I'm at it, I'll also define what PEFA is, because that might not be familiar to many people here as well, and that is the Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Assessment, and that's done by a number of partners, including the World Bank, IMF, the European Commission, France, the UK, and Switzerland. And so with strengthen and use country systems, it was really looking at systems such as the procurement system, any sort of HR systems, so systems that were outside more of typical WASH data sources. And so we went to look at other assessments that had done by the World Bank and other partners.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Betsy. Dominic, I think there's a question you can answer. Could you talk a little bit more about the input paper? Because that paper is a contribution by UNICEF and the World Bank into the preparatory process, and I understand it's more or less in the final stages now. Dominic, if you could talk a bit more about that.
Certainly, yes. I mean, the presentation that I'll give today is loosely based on this discussion paper, but the discussion paper is a 25-odd page paper which just runs through these 3 blocks that I described: the magnitude of the challenge, squeezing more efficiency out of the sector, and how to access additional, particularly domestic private finance for the sector. So it takes readers through that, I hope in a very accessible way, and we're going to release it in English first in the next few days, and then we're going to get it translated also into French in the next couple of weeks. Back to you, Sipari.
Thank you, Dominic. And there's a question about the costing tool. Where can we find the costing tool? So the tool has been sent to all the countries and the focal points in the countries. We also have on the website, so I have just posted the link where you can find various materials about the preparations for the HLM. You will also find on that part of the website the costing tool in French, English, and Spanish. So you could familiarize yourself with that. Just before we get back to Dominic on the broader conversation on the financing. I just want to check if we have colleagues from Nigeria, because we were just talking to them last week, and they actually highlighted sort of they were working with the two, and so if we have Oluyemisi, are you there? Could you just maybe speak a little bit how you've been working with the two? I think maybe that insights from you might also be helpful to other colleagues. Okay, looks like maybe we're not able to have Oluyemisi, but I know that a number of countries are working with the two, and so that and there's also a help desk at the global level to help with that. So there's a question from Dennis.
Can you hear?
Hello,
Can
is
you
that
hear me?
Oluyemisi? Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, please. Okay. So I have with me other members of the country team. About 7 organizations are here represented.
Wonderful, thank
which
you so
includes
much.
the civil society and other development partners. Hello?
We can hear you, Oluyemisi.
Okay, so like we discussed last week, we started working on the costing tool, and before joining the webinar, we actually had a lot of brainstorming, trying to work on the tool. Like we said last week, we're trying to agree on what values to use, and we are limited in some sense with the data that we have in country. So what we've been able to do so far is to work out what we need, our targets, and the current status that we have, and where we are coverage targets for 2030 is. But we are also having, since we don't know the source of data that was imputed in the costing tool, so we are limited in the kind of changes that we can make to the tool, especially under the cost recovery percentages.
Okay, thank you so much, Oluyemisi. That's good insights. And just to indicate that our colleagues are running the global help desk on the use of the costing tool should be able to work with you on the source of the data that is already in there, and like indicated also, some or most of the data that is in there could also be changed to reflect what you now have as the most recent data. But we will put you in touch
Yes.
with Rory. Yes, please.
Yes. And last week when we discussed that, you said if we make any changes, we should add a comment on what we change to and our source, why the reason for changing that and the source of our new data. But we realized the document is protected, so though we can make changes, but we cannot really add comments.
Okay. All right. So I think on that we can continue with the bilateral conversation on that. But it's good to know, and what the interest was just to be able to track some of the new data sources. But I think that should not stop you from being able to make the changes and proceeding as you find useful. So I wanted to move on to some of the few. I think we have one question from Dennis, and then after that we move on. So Dennis is asking how many country profiles are expected for the HLM, and what office or individual is responsible in a country to lead preparation of the country profile. So Betsy, would you take this one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So we The profiles are being prepared by the GLASS team at WHO, and so what will be sent to countries will be already a completed PDF version that then countries can look at. And as I said, the data is coming from existing data sources, so either the GLASS 2013-2014 report or the GLASS 2016 report for those countries who have already submitted their results. And then, so the GLASS team will prepare a finalized profile for you. At first, it'll be in a PDF version, and then if for some reason there's something that the country really strongly disagrees with or they find any mistakes, they can let us know. But what we are sending is a finalized version, and then laid out professionally designed profiles will be available at the HLMs. And then our goal is to have a country profile for every SWA partner. So that is what we are aiming to do at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Betsy. And I think there's one question: what are the countries for which there is data? I think that's from Yona. I think maybe just giving a ballpark number would be good rather than listing the entire country. So Betsy, could you take that? And then I have one question for Dominic, which Dominic you should take as the segue also to the presentation on financing.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't know how many SWA countries have submitted GLASS data. I know that we've received 58 country surveys, and within that there are a number of SWA partners. I can find the actual number though.
Okay, and I think we can share that as well later on with Yona. But I think roughly about 50 of the current SWA partners, just about 50 or slightly more than that, there should be data for that. Dominic, would you take on one question, which is whether we have a date for the FMM yet? That's from Claire, and then after you respond to that, can we move on then to the presentation on financing?
Okay, thanks very much, Sitali. On the date of the FMM, it's likely to be the Thursday or Friday of that week. We're waiting because it's been integrated into the formal agenda for the IMF World Bank Spring Meetings. And as you can imagine, there are an enormous number of parallel meetings happening on everything from debt relief through to education and sanitation and water for all, of course. But the team at the managing director level, it's in their hands of the World Bank at the moment, and they're just finalizing all of these. We should know in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you so much, Dominic. Would you move on now to the financing presentation?
Great. Okay. First, I just wanted to say I'm really impressed by the number of people on this call, and that there are groups of people in many countries sitting together. So this is a really great opportunity to be able to pitch this first presentation. These slides are quite detailed, and so I'm not going to go through all of the detail on them because I really want to get the main messages over. And as we've explained, this discussion paper that's coming out in the next week, also in English and then later in French, will help you all drill down and get more depth for these messages that I'm going to provide as a starter. So first of all, this first slide is really just reiterating what I've mentioned before, that we have these three main blocks: the understanding the challenge, the making more efficient use of existing funds, and easing the transition to increased domestic private finance. And then the fourth bit is what we do after the meetings. So once we've discussed all of these three blocks, is we get into a discussion of how can we collectively, as SWA membership, support countries, or because many of us are countries, how can we work together to define the SDG financing strategy in each country? Sitali, next slide, please. So the first point here on the magnitude of the challenge is really around the increased the increased level of service that the SDGs will provide. They aim to be universal, they aim to address water quality, they aim to address reliability and also proximity to households. And then in addition to those, various aspects about water resource sustainability and affordability. So it really is a shift from the MDG, where it was just about there being some infrastructure, so-called improved infrastructure somewhere in the vicinity, which people may have walked hours to get to. We only measured whether they were using an improved source or not an improved source. Now we're moving into the SDG period, where it's really about quite a sophisticated service that we're trying to get to become universal. Next slide. The costs of doing this. First of all, up to now, Guy Hutton's estimates are that we've spent about $35 billion a year across developing countries to deliver the extent of the MDGs already achieved, right? So past expenditure for all of the progress that we've made over the last 15 years, the estimated amount of expenditure across all countries is $35 billion a year. Now, the estimates that Guy has made for the SDGs are split into basic services, which is the gray striped line or bar in this chart on the right-hand side, and safely managed services, which is the blue stripe bar. Now, what is most apparent immediately is that the blue stripe bar is way, way higher than the gray stripe bar. And the basic services is just about having an improved source within 30 minutes, albeit with better quality. But the safely managed is about having it on plot. And that is a huge jump. And Guy's estimate for this is that it will cost $114 billion a year to deliver this type of level of service. The figure also shows the split between rural-urban sanitation and rural-urban water. And I think what really jumps out again is that urban sanitation is really going to cost a huge amount if we want to get to safely managed. But equally, other sectors too will require a very, very large step change in the current financing levels. So the key message from this slide is the shift from MDGs to SDGs is creating a new and very large financing gap, but it is doing so in a way that will provide a much better quality of service, and therefore we think a much greater opportunity for users to be prepared to pay for those services. Sitali, next slide, please. Now, if we want to deliver this type of quality of services, what we have to do is bring finance from many years ahead into the next 15 years. So what I mean by this is whatever finance we have around, whatever funding we have around at the moment, it's never going to be enough, even if we double donor financing, if we double public taxation, it's not going to reach this level of financing. So what we have to do is find a way to reach out into the future, so reach out into the next 30 or 40 years, and find a way of bringing funding forward and revenues forward to pay for the infrastructure today. So it's like, I guess the best analogy is if you want to build a house today and you don't have the money, you've got to borrow it, and so you build your house, but then you repay it over the next 40 to 50 years. So that's the basic principle that we're looking at and what we need to do to unlock finance. On the next slide, This slide talks rather to utilities, and it's about improving the operating efficiency of utilities. But I'd like to give a couple of other examples for the other subsectors, so not just water, urban water, but also rural water and sanitation, even urban sanitation. So when we talk about efficiency with utilities, it's very much about this reform agenda, utility reform agenda, and improving or reducing non-revenue water and improving the user charges and the bill collection from those users. But for rural water supply, a clear efficiency that we all know about is improving functionality. So if we can go from the current situation where we are building infrastructure, but with 30 to 40% of that infrastructure breaking down within a few years, that is just terribly inefficient. So how can we get better in the rural water sector? And how can we provide the infrastructure but make sure it's a service? And there's a huge amount of work that's been done on this by many different organizations, but it's got to be about sustainable services in rural, and the efficiency gain that we need out of that rural is that nearly half of it currently is just being wasted. So how do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? With sanitation, with rural sanitation, we've made a big step change over the last 10 or so years, moving from subsidies to community-led total sanitation approaches, which is a huge efficiency gain. But there are both a number of countries which haven't completed that switch, and there are a number of countries where the community-led total sanitation is still not being done efficiently. So what we're seeing happening is we get a good initial shift to open defecation-free villages, and then slippage back towards open defecation. So how can we prevent that? In urban sanitation, an efficiency gain that we can strive for is moving from the idea that we're going to plan just big sewer systems to fecal sludge management chains. How can we make this a much more efficient shift towards urban sanitation using the idea of fecal sludge management chains rather than just building huge sewers? So my point on this slide, which I've labored rather because I've had feedback before that this is too much about utilities, I'm pointing out that there are many different efficiency gains that we need to work on as a sector. Next slide. This slide is simply trying to explain the various blocks. We have tariffs, which user fees, we have transfers, which are aid, and we have taxes. Those are the funding sources. Those are what we have, as it were, that we know will come and pay for the expansion and operation and maintenance of existing services. But we have on the right-hand side repayable financing, the concessional finance from the multilateral development banks, and the potential for private finance. And essentially what we're wanting to try and do over the beginning of the SDG period is make the institutions that manage tariff transfers and taxes connect with these repayable financing sources. Next slide. There's a vision that we need to invoke in the sector. And I think that vision is that ultimately user fees, user charges, tariffs should be the predominant source of funding in the sector. We know that currently when a government subsidizes a utility, it's very inefficient for a number of reasons. It's inefficient because it's a subsidy to operation and maintenance for a utility which only benefits those people who are connected to it. And we all know that many poor people aren't connected to those services. And so how can we improve the efficiency of those utilities to free up what is currently just being plowed into subsidies for wealthier people, how can we improve the efficiency of those utilities, take those subsidies and actually make new connections for poorer people. So the ultimate aim is to get away from subsidies, and a vision is that we move towards user payments for the running of the water sector. Next slide. So what doesn't come from tariffs? If we've got user tariffs, user fees, but we still do need public finance. Public finance is still very, very important. Taxes, public taxes, play a critical catalytic part in the sector. They play the part of funding sector governance. So how to regulate the sector, how to do the policy planning and budgeting in the sector. These are key things that have to be done and have to be paid from somewhere, and certainly in the transition as countries develop may need to be paid out of public funds. We also know that public funds are needed to connect poorer communities. We know that public funds are needed for maybe some subsectors more than other subsectors. For example, rural sanitation, which is difficult to drive just from user finance. So public finances play a key part, but if we can free up public finance, which is currently being ploughed into inefficient subsidies in utilities, then it allows us to use those subsidies for the things which are really pressingly required in the sector, like these sector governance and subsector issues. Next slide. So this slide just tries to help us understand. On the left-hand side in the blue column, you've got the costs of meeting services for the SDGs, and on the right-hand side you have the tariffs, taxes and transfers, which is the funding sources we currently have. And essentially we've got to fill this gap with the concessional and commercial finance. Next slide. So what do we have to do that with? Well, there's a range of different types of financing instruments that we can use. For the large infrastructure, we can use things like bonds. For smaller infrastructure, we can use commercial bank loans, vendor finance, supplier finance, and even microfinance. And here, microfinance is important to think about in a couple of different ways. Microfinance can be very useful, as we know, in the rural sanitation sector. There have been very successful schemes in Bangladesh, for example, where microfinance has helped people finance their sanitation, their improvements in sanitation. But they can also help people make connections to utilities, and they can help groups, communities of people borrow to expand and extend their systems in rural areas. Next slide. But blending finance is a really key notion. Currently, the way that we use particularly aid, which is one of the only sources of finance that we can move from one country to another country, but also how we use public finance, taxes, it's very rare to see that the water sector or sanitation use these public sources of capital to blend with private sources. So we all know that private money is more expensive. It's common for private money to cost in the region of 10 to 20% a year in developing countries. But currently we just don't blend it with the publicly available finance. So we expect the use of private finance to be done at that sort of level, 10 to 20%, which is quite high. It requires a very high financial return to be able to recover that. But if we blended it with public finance, we could bring that down to 3 or 4% by mixing grant money with this concessional loans and with private finance. Next slide. So this last slide of substance here, before I recap, is really about a progression that we envisage. On the left-hand, going from the left-hand side, you have the costs and the funding, and this is your starting point, a huge financing gap, and the first thing we need to do is develop this financing strategy and figure out what cost savings we can make. That's step 2. So by making those cost savings, we just bring down the costs in the sector and therefore our financing requirements. We can then, in step 3, increase taxes and tariffs to the sector. So we increase taxes by lobbying, by encouraging governments to spend more in the sector, and we increase tariffs by making sure that there's greater collection of user fees and charges within the sector. And this definitely doesn't just apply to urban utilities. Yes, it's perhaps couched in the language of urban utilities, but it's just as important in rural water supply as well. We know that it's the business models in rural water supply are relatively poor, particularly for hand pumps. And so this is a real area that we need to work in rural water supply as well. Step 4 is about mobilizing, particularly domestic private finance to fill that financing gap. And step 5, the services finance sustainably going forward. So then to summarize briefly, next slide. I think that the main points here are that strategic financial planning is going to be key. And the most important part of that strategic financial planning actually makes a reference back to the costing spreadsheet that many of you are working on, which is how are we going to split going forward the public element versus the user element in each of the sectors for cost recovery. So going forward, are we going to just have government subsidizing all services, or are we going to be moving in many countries towards a sector which is financed to a greater degree from user fees and charges? Because the further you bring it across into being financed from user fees, the greater the chances are that we can borrow future money to pay for building new services today. So that's really the main message from this. And then Sitali, can you go on to the last slide, please? And so the question then is, how do we support this transition to a mix of public and private finance? And here it's about incentivizing service providers, limiting the use of foreign exchange, so getting borrowing to happen domestically, supporting the development of capital markets, creating opportunities for subnational borrowing, and using these public resources, the MDB, government grants, etc., in a smarter way by blending them, and most importantly, by starting now. Thank you. Back to you, Stan.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That was comprehensive. And just to check now if there are any questions. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat. And if you have a mic-enabled device, please feel free to just jump in and get your questions through to Dominic on the financing component. So like Dominic was saying, this presentation to a great extent summarizes the input paper. So you should be looking out for that paper when it comes out, and we'll put it also on the website. There's a question from Thomas, will the slide pack be circulated? So yes, we'll circulate the slide pack and we'll also put it on the website. But we've just taken note of that message, Thomas. So I'll just give it a second to see if there are any questions. So another comment on sharing the presentation from Keridwen. Bishnu, thank you so much. We realize it's late in your day, so thank you so much for joining. So there's a question from Gregor: will the Ministers of Finance be invited by the World Bank for the SWA HLM? So Dominic, if you could take that.
Yes, the World Bank will send out the invitations, but and we're just working out. We were meeting with Kevin Rudd yesterday. It's equally important that it's very clearly SWA and not just the World Bank. But the point I was making about this date, which has been frankly a source of frustration, nailing it down, is because this meeting is part of the World Bank IMF Spring Meeting. So it's an integral part of that, and it will be on the main agenda. So it is hosted by the World Bank, but it's clearly going to be an SWA meeting.
Thank you, Dominic. We have two more questions. One from Wilhelmina Malima in Tanzania, sitting with Rebecca and I believe 19 other people around the table, 20 people on the table in Tanzania. So that's really exciting. So the question is, I believe this is more a comment: we will need more support to operationalize this. So Dominic, if you could talk a little bit more on how colleagues at country level could actually use this. Is it more in formats of sort of the analysis once the costing tool is done, and then having discussions on this? So if you could talk a little bit about that. And then also from Prakash, I believe this is the team sitting with Prakash in Kampala, Uganda. We as Ugandan team have observed that the just concluded presentation is all about water. Where is the sanitation financing? So Dominic, if you could cover that one as well. That's two questions so far. And then there is a question from Sudan, from the CSO rep. I believe this is Hanan in Sudan, or another colleague there, who will implement this model. So Dominic, if we could have those three questions covered, and then we'll get back to the other questions. There's actually a lot now that have come up. Thank you.
Great. I think the first and the third are very similar. They're about how we implement these, how we get into this discussion. The key thing is going through this costing process is the first step. So the costing spreadsheets, which are really an amazing resource, probably the most interesting part of that whole spreadsheet are these boxes on who is going to pay for what. Is it users, or is it from taxes? Is it public finance? And the split between what is going to be privately or user funded versus publicly funded is the key policy discussion, which I would hope it begins to happen in each of the countries. So that's the first step, and the discussion paper will help you as well, provide you with further ideas and examples of how to initiate that discussion. Then, once we get to the finance ministers meeting, I think one of the key agreements that we hope to generate through that discussion is that finance ministers will begin to talk with water ministers and with health ministers about what finance, not just that the sector needs, but what finance the sector can bring to the table. Because as Kevin Rudd, who is really, it's great fun working with him because he puts things frames them in the language of a finance minister. When a finance minister sees a sector minister turn up in his office or her office, the first question is, why do you want money? You're here because you need money. And we need to change that conversation. We need to change it from, yes, we understand you need money, but what money will you also bring to the table from your sector? Going on to the sanitation question, I think the paper is perhaps better than this presentation at bringing out the sanitation aspect. But microfinance in Bangladesh has been a major driver of improving sanitation. And I think that's only actually one aspect of the financing story on rural sanitation. Because the other part of it is currently, and you've got to think broadly in terms of the sector, if we're dumping huge amounts of subsidy into urban water right now, if we can free that up, then we can start to use that to fund the sanitation promotion and awards and everything else that we need in the rural sanitation sector. Back to you, Stanley.
So Dominic, if you could just hang on to that thought on sanitation. So some question very closely related from Annie in Malawi. I'd like to know if the analysis under sanitation assumes hygiene as inherent, or is this something that is separate? So Dominic, if you can take that quickly, because it links very closely with what you were just talking about, and then we have several more questions.
So absolutely, I mean, hygiene, I think the question around hygiene is, clearly hygiene is largely funded by users. I mean, users buy soap, users find the water that they need, but there is this public sector element which is about the promoting knowledge and understanding of hygiene. And that is key. We don't want unfunded mandates in the sector. And we need to make that very clear. But we also need as a sector to say, we'll get an efficiency out of this part of the sector in order to fund this crucial catalytic element of public finance, which is promoting hygiene.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. So we have, I note Fiona is highlighting that there's a question from Musa. I think that question is about M&E and Carl. So I'll come back to that when we're done with the questions on the financing presentation. So the two questions that I would like you to pick at this moment, Dominic, one from Rove in the Netherlands, I believe. How does SWA want to engage with private financiers, banks, if blending becomes more important? The other question from Rebecca in Tanzania is, how is the global technical support organized, and how can we at country level access it? So Dominic, if you could talk a little bit more about the possible support in terms of this analysis and internalizing the input paper as well. And I can respond to part of that at some point, but grateful if you could take these questions.
Thanks. On the second question first, this help desk, and Sitali was no doubt about to mention that too, is a first port of call. But we're going to try and make sure that there are other people around who can help in different languages as well on thinking through particularly the completion of these costing sheets. In terms of the question from the Netherlands about how does SWA engage the private sector, I think that's a very good question, and one that we were discussing yesterday. Currently, our private sector constituency as SWA doesn't necessarily include many potential domestic financiers. And I think that we as SWA members need to encourage our private sector constituency to grow in that direction. Sitali, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. So we have a few more questions, and I just wanted to indicate, because now it's right on the hour, that what we had intended to do in terms of covering the substantive presentations is done, but we'll still leave the webinar open for this discussion as it is ongoing until the questions are exhausted. So for those that want to leave at this point, or those that want to stay, that's fine. I just wanted to kind of make that clear. And thank you so much. So if you plan to leave, do not forget to put the name in the chat if you haven't done so, and if you're joining with other colleagues, please do indicate who those colleagues are. Would like to keep track of everybody who's been on the call. So there's a question from Bishnu about support for the finance minister to attend the finance minister's meeting, that in the past there wasn't support because that was part of the regular spring meetings. Would SWA be in a position to support this time around? Bishnu, I think we can also have a bilateral on this to kind of have clarification. This finance ministers meeting takes advantage of the fact that finance ministers are already in Washington for the spring meetings, and our understanding is that they would already be traveling for that as part of their regular schedules with the World Bank and IMF. But if in your case this is different, please let us have that conversation. We can have that via email to figure out exactly what's the best situation for Lao. And then in Egypt, IHAB has a question. We have in Egypt two sectors, ministers, water resources minister and housing minister responsible for water and sanitation will both be invited to the HLM. The guidance we have here is that up to two sector ministers could be invited to the sector ministers meeting. And these are ministers that are responsible for sanitation and water. And if you indicate to the Secretariat, to us, the two ministers, the invitation should be able to be prepared. But that's up to two ministers, primarily responsible for water and sanitation. So we can take that conversation as well bilaterally, IHAB, but that's the guidance that we have this far. A question from Nigeria, from Ogochukwu, that Nigeria is currently trying to implement this mix by engaging microfinance institutions to provide finance for household sanitation facilities through loans. However, getting the guarantee through the central bank is slow and needs a lot of convincing. So Dominic, if you could take note of that and maybe offer some remarks on that, that would be great. I think we've covered the question from IHAB. And then from Musa, I would be glad to have some more points on how we mobilize finance sector for financing of sanitation from tax. Dominic, if you could also offer remarks on that in terms of financing sanitation from tax. And then Vishnu is just agreeing with IHAB about the situation of having two ministers that could potentially be invited. So I think that's the same. We can get back to these two countries on that on a bilateral basis. Dominic, could you come back on the questions that we have so far? And then we have additional parts that we can cover later. Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, on the guarantees in Nigeria, I've experienced this problem across a number of countries, and there are other members of our team that have even more experience on this. This can be a frustrating and long process, particularly where sovereign guarantees are involved. And in fact, what we want to do is we want to try and get away from sovereign guarantees. We want to get towards more commercial forms of guarantee. But the good news is that there really is a very wide range of guarantees available. And the teams at the bank and IFC and in other places who work on these will be putting together a compendium, if you like, of the types of guarantees that there are out there. On raising taxes for sanitation, I mean, it's about argument in my view, and I think that currently with very, very inefficient utilities, we need to make the argument and demonstrate that it's possible to make our utilities more efficient and therefore shift finance to sanitation, particularly rural sanitation. Back to you, Scott.
Okay, thank you so much, Dominic. I see that most of the comments that we have were more or less just comments. I think there was a point by Thomas about whether they will be meeting notes. What we'll do is that we have this webinar recorded, and we'll put it on the website with a quick summary of the webinar itself. And then you could always revisit that in case there is need. There is a question from Annie, which is about she says, the big question in my mind is how will inequalities be tackled, especially with the changing language on financing. So Dominic, if you could respond to that quickly. I think most of the rest of the points are just about people who were joining the call. So if you could respond to that question from Annie, Dominic.
Yeah, I think this is a key one, Annie. I mean, there are two things here. The first one is basic question: is water a public or a private good? And clearly we know, or an economic good, and clearly we know it's both. And we're never going to be able to resolve that philosophical argument. But the more important thing here, and really the practical thing here, is that we know, particularly in urban areas, but also in rural areas, that effectively people who are not connected, who don't have access to improved sources, are paying more. In urban areas, it's literally, if you're not connected to the utility, you're buying from vendors, therefore you are paying more for your water. If we can connect people, we can reduce the amount that they're spending on water. So that in urban areas, I think the argument is really quite crisp, that we need to improve the efficiency of utilities in order to lower the costs for poorer people. In rural areas, it's slightly more an economic argument, which is that poorer people are paying more because it's costing them more in their health, with their health. And so we need to get around that by connecting them and improving their access to services, and that will make them healthier, wealthier people. So either way, it's just one is a more financial argument in urban, and the economic argument is in rural. But look, I'd like to hear more on people's perspectives, not just in this webinar, but also directly, because I think this is a key part of the argument that needs to be made, and made well, leading up to and at these meetings. Back to you, Study.
Thank you, Dominic. They look like those were most of the questions that we had on the finance, on the financing component. And if there will be more, I will let you know. Or if there's somebody who wants to pick up the mic and just to speak straight, please feel free to do that. In the meanwhile, I will respond to the question from Musa, which was about whether SWA has harmonized with AMCAO on the indicators. I'm thinking that this should be with reference to the collaborative behaviors indicators. Our understanding is that so far this work on the collaborative behaviors indicators is being done in a harmonized fashion through the UN GLASS team that is preparing the collaborative behaviors. Other processes in terms of monitoring or accountability platforms, SWA has in the past worked with commitments, which we had conversations also with our colleagues in AMCAO in ensuring that these more or less reinforce each other. But at this meeting, the 2017 high-level meeting, there will not be a process of tabling commitments. We might come back to that at some point in terms of revisiting the accountability mechanism, but the meeting is not in the same fashion as in the past. However, the country overview document, which we suggested, has at the end some form of actions that governments and partners have more or less agreed to undertake in the coming years for them to catalyze action around the SDGs. So you might find that maybe some of those actions are specific on building blocks or collaborative behaviors, but we are urging also that they should be smart in terms of being time-bound, in terms of being measurable and attainable, so that they fit the context as well. So that, I hope, Musa, helps to address some of your questions. And if there are no questions as it is seeming now, may I just make very few remarks in terms of getting to a close? And maybe before I do that, could I just check with Dominic if you have anything additional to say in terms of any suggested next steps? Dominic, if you have any sort of comments to make, I think that this would be the best time to do so.
No, thanks, Sutali. Just watch out for the paper which is coming, and we are around. I mean, tell us if you don't, if you want to understand things which aren't clearly set out. this paper is really meant for, it is an input to the discussion. It's not meant to be the definitive paper. We want people to be critical, constructive, hopefully, but constructively critical about these ideas. And the aim is towards the high-level meeting itself, condensing this paper down into 4 pages of the main messages. And I think that is really an SWA collective activity. So this input paper is a UNICEF World Bank paper, just to get the discussion started, but we really welcome and encourage discussion and constructive criticism throughout this next 2 months. Back to you, Sitali, and thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dominic. And Betsy, are you still there? Do you want, I know you had mentioned about the collaborative behavior country profiles when they're coming out. Any sort of final remarks that you might have on that?
Hi, Sitali. Nothing specific. I would just say be on the lookout for the collaborative behavior country profiles, and do let the GLASS team know if you have any questions or comments about them.
Great, thank you so much. I also see we have Guy Hutton, who we had mentioned a lot that he's him and one of a consultant that we have also sort of working around the support on the costing too. So Guy, just to mention that we talked about the costing too as well, and we'll be channeling the requests that we have to you, and those that are able to write to Guy, you should be able to do so. Just in terms of next steps, for all the countries, we will send to you the presentations, and we will also put this presentation on the website, so our colleagues should be able to receive these presentations through the global mailing list. I think that it will be necessary for those countries that require bilateral conversation. Please do let us know. We're more than keen to help with that, and also to link you with the Global Help Desk on the costing too. So if you do have a request on the costing too, or any part of the preparatory process, including the input paper, please do not hesitate to get back in touch with us, and we should facilitate that discussion. And then Guys just confirming that they're available to help provide support and review any adjustments that colleagues might have on the costing too. So I think that should also help with our colleagues in Nigeria who had some questions on this, but we'll sort of take that conversation offline. And then we're not planning another big global webinar, but in case there's a request coming from a few countries, we will be able to organize that and also announce it just for the interest of others that would want to join. And that could be on anything starting from the SDG baseline and vision. If there is more that is needed on the SDG the SDG ladder for the indicators, we could be able to organize that. If it's on the sector review in terms of building blocks and collaborative behaviors, we can organize a follow-up webinar. If it is again on the financing component, we should be able to do that. So please do not hesitate to let us know. Thank you very much, and we should keep in touch via emails and other platforms, and all the best with the preparations. Thank you. Thank you again, everyone who's able to put their names in the chat, and we see the list as well from Tanzania. Thank you, Rebecca. So for those that have not yet told us your name and where you're joining from, again, please do so. We're just keen to make sure that in case there's a country that we have missed, we'd be happy to make some extra follow-ups. And that is why we're asking for colleagues to put their names in the chat. So grateful for those that have not yet done so to actually put their names in the chat. Thank you. Brian, thank you so much. It was great to have you and colleagues also from Zambia joining. Thank you, Lisa.